November 13th, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Oberst Werner Osterheld crouched in a concrete bunker 8 feet underground, his hands pressed against his ears as the world above him disintegrated. He had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front. He had endured the hell of Stalingrad's encirclement. He had witnessed Soviet artillery barrages that turned entire city blocks into rubble. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. The American Fourth Infantry Division had begun firing at 0400 hours. It was now 1400 hours, 10 continuous hours. The bombardment had not paused, it had not slackened. Wave after wave of shells crashed into the German positions with mechanical precision. Osterheld scribbled in his notebook, his handwriting barely legible from the constant concussion. They are not attempting to conserve ammunition. They are not firing for effect and then waiting. They are simply destroying everything. Every bunker, every trench, every square meter of forest. This is not artillery as we understand it. This is industrial annihilation. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Osterheld could not know, what no German soldier in the Hürtgen Forest understood that November morning, was that they were about to experience the single most concentrated artillery bombardment ever delivered by one division in military history. In the next 24 hours, the American Fourth Infantry Division would fire 250,000 artillery shells. Not across weeks of battle, not spread among multiple divisions. One division, one day. 250,000 shells raining down on a forest that had become a graveyard for thousands of German and American soldiers alike. The mathematics were staggering. 250,000 shells in 24 hours meant 10,416 shells every hour, 173 shells every minute, nearly 3 shells every single second for an entire day without pause. The Germans defending the Hürtgen had never encountered sustained fire at this intensity. More critically, they had not believed such fire was even possible. The Hürtgen Forest campaign had become a nightmare for both sides by November 1944. The dense forest straddling the German-Belgian border presented terrain that negated American advantages in armor and air power. Trees grew so thick that tanks could not maneuver. The forest canopy prevented effective airstrikes. German defenders had fortified the area with concrete pillboxes, extensive minefields, and mutually supporting defensive positions designed to bleed American units white. From September through early November, American divisions had attacked into the Hürtgen and suffered catastrophic casualties. The 1st Infantry Division lost, 4,000 men taking a handful of villages. The 9th Infantry Division was shattered, attempting to capture the town of Schmidt. The forest's terrain channeled American attacks into killing zones, where German machine guns and mortars inflicted horrific losses. Artillery, the Americans' most effective weapon, was partially neutralized by the forest itself. Shells exploding in the dense tree canopy created deadly tree bursts that killed attackers and defenders alike. Forward observers struggled to see targets through the undergrowth. German positions were so well camouflaged that even direct observation often failed to locate them. By early November, American commanders recognized that the Hürtgen offensive was failing. Units were exhausted, casualties were unsustainable. The 4th Infantry Division, preparing to relieve shattered formations, needed a new approach. They would not attempt to fight their way through the forest using infantry tactics that had already failed. Instead, they would use artillery to simply obliterate the German defensive system entirely. The 4th Infantry Division was one of the U.S. Army's most experienced formations by November 1944. They had landed on Utah Beach on D-Day, fought through the Normandy hedgerows, participated in the liberation of Paris, and pushed into Germany itself. The division had learned hard lessons about German defensive capabilities and had developed doctrine emphasizing overwhelming fire support before infantry advanced. The division's artillery consisted of 4 battalions, 3 battalions of 105mm howitzers, 36 guns total, 1 battalion of 155mm howitzers, 12 guns. These 48 divisional guns formed the foundation of the artillery support, but they represented only a fraction of the firepower available. American artillery doctrine by late 1944 had evolved to allow division commanders to call upon Corps and Army artillery to support divisional attacks. The 4th Infantry Division's commander, Major General Raymond Barton, requested and received attachment of additional artillery battalions from 7 Corps. 8 more battalions were assigned directly to support the division's attack. 155mm gun battalions firing the long-range M1 gun. 8-inch howitzer battalions capable of destroying concrete fortifications. Additional 105mm battalions to increase volume of fire. These Corps artillery units brought the total number of guns supporting the 4th Division to over 120 pieces. But even this was not sufficient for what Barton planned. He requested and received authorization to call upon 1st Army Artillery for counter-battery fire and deep interdiction missions. This added another 40 guns to the total available. When the 4th Division attacked on November 13th, they could draw upon 160 artillery pieces, all dedicated to supporting a single division's advance. The concentration of firepower was unprecedented. German divisions typically had 36 artillery pieces for divisional support, with Corps artillery requiring extensive coordination to employ. The 4th Division had more than 4 times the artillery of a German division, all responsive to division fire direction, all capable of firing within minutes of a request from forward observers. The ammunition supply required to sustain such massive fire was staggering. Each 105mm shell weighed 33 pounds. Each 155mm shell weighed 95 pounds. Heavier calibers weighed substantially more. 250,000 shells represented thousands of tons of high explosive and steel. Logistics officers had spent weeks stockpiling ammunition at forward dumps. Trucks ran continuously from rear depots, delivering shells to battery positions. Each artillery battery established massive ammunition points, stacking shells in prepared positions protected by camouflage and dispersion. By the morning of November 13th, the 4th Division had accumulated enough ammunition to fire continuously for days if necessary. German intelligence had detected the American build-up. Reconnaissance patrols reported seeing truck convoys moving forward. Aerial observation, limited by American air superiority, noted increased activity behind American lines. But German analysts failed to grasp the scale of what was being prepared. They assumed the Americans were preparing another conventional attack, similar to previous failed attempts. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber commanded a reinforced company holding positions in the northern Hürtgen. His men occupied bunkers and fighting positions that had repulsed multiple American attacks throughout October and early November. In his diary, discovered after the war, Weber described the confidence his troops felt on the evening of November 12th. The Americans have tried everything. Infantry attacks supported by armor, which the forest terrain renders useless. Airstrikes that accomplish nothing against our bunkers. Artillery preparation followed by assault, which we defeat with machine gun and mortar fire. Each attack costs them hundreds of casualties while we lose dozens. They cannot break through. The forest is our ally. It negates their material advantages. Here, German tactical skill and defensive preparation are superior to American industrial might. Weber's assessment reflected standard German thinking about the Hürtgen. The terrain neutralized American advantages. German defensive positions, strengthened over months, could withstand anything the Americans could deliver. Previous attacks had validated this belief. American units had been bled white, attempting to advance through prepared defenses. The 4th Division's fire plan for November 13th was designed by Lieutenant Colonel William Westmoreland, the division artillery commander who would later command American forces in Vietnam. Westmoreland understood that previous artillery preparations had failed because they were insufficient in duration and intensity. German defenders survived in bunkers, then emerged to man positions when American infantry attacked. Westmoreland's plan was brutally simple. Fire enough shells, for long enough duration, to physically destroy every German position regardless of fortification strength. Do not pause. Do not allow defenders time to recover. Continue firing until German positions ceased to exist as military obstacles. The plan divided the target area into grid squares of 100 meters. Each grid square was assigned a specific number of shells based on intelligence about German fortifications. Heavily fortified areas received concentrated fire from 155mm and 8-inch howitzers. Less fortified areas received saturation fire from 105mm howitzers. No area was left untargeted. Forward observers were positioned to adjust fire in real time. Radio communication allowed instant transmission of target coordinates to fire direction centers. The entire system was designed to deliver responsive, accurate fire continuously without pause from the moment the barrage began. At 0400 hours on November 13th, 1944, the first shells left American gun tubes. The sound was described by witnesses as resembling continuous thunder, a rolling roar that never ceased. German positions 3 kilometers away felt the concussion through the ground before the first shells impacted. Oberst Osterheld, commanding the defense sector, was in his command bunker when the bombardment began. His communication lines to forward positions were severed within minutes as shells cut telephone cables. Radio communication became impossible due to continuous concussion, disrupting equipment. Runners sent to check positions never returned, killed by shell fragments in the forest. The bombardment followed a specific pattern. First, counter-battery fire targeted known German artillery positions. American counter-battery radar had located most German guns during previous operations. Now, 155mm guns and 8-inch howitzers delivered concentrated fire on these positions. Lieutenant Hans Schäfer commanded a battery of German 105mm howitzers positioned in a clearing 2 kilometers behind the front line. His battery had fired in support of defensive operations for weeks, displacing frequently to avoid American counter-battery fire. On the morning of November 13th, his battery was caught in position by the American bombardment. Schäfer's after-action report, written in a field hospital 3 days later, described the destruction. The first shells arrived at 0410, 6 salvos of heavy caliber, probably 155mm or larger. 3 guns were destroyed immediately. My number 2 gun took a direct hit that detonated ready ammunition, killing the entire crew. I ordered displacement, but before we could limber the remaining guns, a second barrage arrived. All remaining guns were destroyed. 32 men killed or wounded out of a battery strength of 83. Total time from first shell to battery destruction, 4 minutes. German artillery across the sector suffered similar fates. Batteries that attempted to return fire were immediately targeted by American counter-battery. Batteries that remained silent were destroyed by systematic area fire. By 0530, 90 minutes into the bombardment, German artillery support had been effectively eliminated. With German guns silenced, American artillery shifted to methodical destruction of defensive positions. Forward observers directed fire onto bunkers and fighting positions identified during previous operations. Each identified position received concentrated fire until observers confirmed destruction. 155mm shells could penetrate 3 feet of reinforced concrete. 8-inch shells could destroy bunkers that would withstand smaller calibers. The Americans fired both in combinations, ensuring that even the strongest positions were eventually reduced to rubble. Gefreiter Otto Reinhardt survived the bombardment in a concrete bunker designed to withstand direct hits from field artillery. The bunker, constructed by Organisation TOT engineers, had 5-foot-thick reinforced concrete walls and roof. Inside, 15 men waited as the bombardment intensified. Reinhardt's account, recorded by American intelligence officers after his capture, provides insight into the experience of being under sustained artillery fire. The first hour was bearable. Shells impacted constantly, but our bunker held. We had survived artillery before. We believed we would survive this. After 2 hours, the concussion became unbearable. Each impact felt like being struck in the chest. Men vomited from the continuous shock. Our ears bled. We could not hear each other speak, even when shouting directly into someone's ear. After 3 hours, Cracks appeared in the concrete ceiling. Dust filled the bunker. We soaked cloth in water and covered our faces to breathe. The entrance was buried under debris. We were entombed. After 4 hours, portions of the ceiling collapsed. 2 men were crushed. We tried to dig out the entrance, but shells continued landing too close. Anyone who emerged would be killed instantly.
After 6 hours, I no longer cared if I lived or died.
I wanted the bombardment to stop more than I wanted to survive. The continuous concussion destroyed rational thought. We simply endured, minute by minute, hour by hour, praying for it to end. It did not end. It continued without pause throughout the day and into the night. Reinhardt's bunker, one of the strongest in the sector, eventually collapsed after 18 hours of bombardment. He and 4 survivors were pulled from the rubble by American infantry and sent to prisoner of war camps. 10 men died in the collapse. The systematic destruction extended beyond fortified positions. American artillery fired on roads to crater them and prevent reinforcement. Trails through the forest were targeted to interdict movement. Assembly areas were saturated with fire to prevent German units from massing for counterattacks. Supply dumps identified by reconnaissance were destroyed by high-explosive shells. The forest itself became a weapon against German defenders. Artillery shells exploding in the tree canopy created tree bursts that showered wooden and steel fragments over wide areas. Trenches and foxholes that would protect against ground bursts offered no protection against tree bursts. German soldiers huddling in open positions were killed by fragments raining down from above. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, a veteran NCO who had survived Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front, was wounded by tree-burst fragments on November 13th. His letter to his family, intercepted by Allied sensors and preserved in archives, compared American and Soviet artillery. The Russians fired massive barrages, thousands of shells in brief periods before attacks. They were terrifying but brief. You survived by going deep into bunkers or trenches and waiting for the storm to pass. The Russians would then attack, and we would emerge to fight them. The American method is different. They do not fire for a short time and then attack. They fire continuously, hour after hour, giving no time to recover, no pause to repair positions or evacuate wounded. They are destroying the forest itself. Trees fall everywhere, blocking movement, crushing fighting positions. This is not artillery preparation. This is systematic annihilation. By noon on November 13th, the 4th Division had fired approximately 125,000 shells, half the total for the day. German defensive positions throughout the sector had been substantially degraded, but the bombardment did not stop. American artillery officers, following Westmoreland's plan, continued firing according to schedule. The psychological impact on German survivors equaled the physical destruction. Soldiers who had endured years of combat, who had survived massive Soviet offensives, found themselves breaking under sustained American fire. Unit cohesion collapsed as men refused to remain in positions being systematically destroyed. Hauptmann Weber, the company commander who had expressed confidence the previous evening, was killed when his command bunker took a direct hit from an 8-inch shell at 1300 hours. His executive officer, attempting to coordinate the defense, was wounded by shell fragments and evacuated. By mid-afternoon, the company had ceased to exist as an organized unit. Throughout the sector, similar dissolution occurred. Company and battalion commanders lost contact with their units. Telephone lines were cut. Radios were destroyed or rendered useless by concussion. Runners could not move through the continuous shell fire. German tactical control, which depended on strong leadership and communication, disintegrated under the bombardment. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. German reinforcements attempting to reach the front were destroyed before arriving. American artillery observers, watching roads and trails with binoculars, called fire missions on any movement. German columns advancing to reinforce positions found themselves under immediate, accurate fire that scattered units and inflicted heavy casualties. Oberst Osterheld, commanding the sector, attempted to organize counterattacks using reserve units. These units, positioned in rear areas, were supposed to move forward and restore defensive lines. But American artillery targeted assembly areas, preventing units from forming up. Attempts to move forward in small groups were detected and engaged by forward observers who could call down artillery fire within minutes. The only German forces that survived relatively intact were those deep in bunkers who remained hidden and silent throughout the bombardment. These survivors, emerging after the fire lifted, discovered that their defensive positions had been obliterated, their communication systems destroyed, and their supporting units annihilated. The American ammunition expenditure for November 13th was carefully documented. Supply officers recorded every shell fired, tracking ammunition consumption to ensure adequate stocks remained for subsequent operations. The final count, verified through multiple independent records, totaled 250,000 shells fired in 24 hours. Breaking down this total by caliber provides insight into the fire plan's execution. 105mm howitzers fired approximately 150,000 shells, 60% of the total. These lighter weapons provided high-volume fire against area targets, trenches, and lightly fortified positions. 155mm howitzers and guns fired approximately 75,000 shells, 30% of the total. These medium weapons targeted bunkers, command posts, and hardened positions requiring heavier calibers for destruction. 8-inch howitzers and heavier weapons fired approximately 25,000 shells, 10% of the total. These heavy weapons were employed against the strongest fortifications and for deep interdiction fire on roads and assembly areas. The logistics of delivering this quantity of ammunition was itself remarkable. Each shell required transportation from depot to battery position. Trucks ran continuously, delivering ammunition under all conditions. Road networks behind American lines operated at maximum capacity. Supply officers coordinated traffic to prevent congestion while ensuring batteries never ran short. German prisoners captured after the bombardment consistently described their shock at American ammunition expenditure. They had been taught that artillery fire should be carefully rationed, that each shell represented significant industrial capacity, and that wasteful fire indicated poor fire discipline. The American bombardment contradicted everything they understood about artillery employment. Lieutenant Schaefer, the artillery battery commander whose guns were destroyed in the opening minutes, was interrogated by American intelligence officers. His comments, preserved in interrogation reports, revealed German incomprehension at American methods. "I calculated that your division fired more ammunition in one day than my entire corps was allocated for a month. This is not normal artillery employment. You are using shells the way machine guns use bullets. How can your industry produce such quantities? How can your logistics deliver them to guns? We were always told American industry was focused on unnecessary consumer goods, that America lacked capacity for military production. This was obviously false. You have so much industrial capacity that you can waste ammunition on a scale we cannot match." The concept of wasting ammunition reflected fundamental differences between American and German military culture. Germans, fighting with limited resources throughout the war, emphasized conservation and precision. Every shell should serve a clear purpose. Excessive fire was wasteful and indicated poor training. Americans, backed by enormous industrial capacity, emphasized overwhelming firepower. If firing 10,000 shells ensured destroying a target that 100 shells might destroy, then fire 10,000 shells. The objective was not ammunition, conservation, but complete destruction of enemy capability to resist. This philosophical difference extended to tactical doctrine. German doctrine emphasized skillful employment of limited resources. A German battery commander's success was measured by how effectively he supported operations while conserving ammunition. American doctrine emphasized responsive fire support, regardless of ammunition expenditure. An American battery commander's success was measured by how effectively he destroyed targets, with ammunition consumption a secondary consideration. The 4th Division's bombardment on November 13th exemplified this American approach. The objective was not to soften German defences for an infantry attack. The objective was to physically destroy German defensive capabilities so completely that infantry would face minimal resistance. At 0400 hours on November 14th, exactly 24 hours after the bombardment began, American artillery shifted to rolling, barrage supporting infantry advance. The infantry, 4th Division regiments that had waited through the previous day while artillery pulverized German positions, now advanced into the smoking, devastated forest. They encountered minimal resistance. German survivors, those who had endured the bombardment in deep bunkers or who happened to occupy positions that escaped direct hits, were too shocked and disoriented to mount effective defense. Most surrendered immediately upon seeing American infantry. Others retreated without fighting, unwilling to remain in positions that could draw renewed artillery fire. The 4th Division advanced approximately 2 kilometers on November 14th, penetrating German defensive lines that had held against multiple previous attacks. Casualties were extraordinarily light compared to earlier Hürtgen operations. The artillery bombardment had accomplished its purpose. Oberst Osterheld, pulled from his collapsed command bunker by German medics, was evacuated to a rear area hospital. His combat career was over. In the hospital, he wrote a final report analyzing the November 13th bombardment. This report, captured when American forces overran the hospital, provided German assessment of American artillery effectiveness. The Americans have developed artillery employment beyond anything we anticipated. Their ammunition supply is unlimited. Their coordination allows one division to employ artillery resources equivalent to an entire corps. Their fire control allows sustained, accurate fire over extended periods. Most significantly, they are willing to expend ammunition at rates we consider wasteful to achieve complete destruction of defensive positions. This combination of industrial capacity, technical coordination, and tactical willingness to expend resources creates an artillery system we cannot match. German defensive doctrine assumes the enemy cannot sustain intensive fire indefinitely. This assumption is invalid against American artillery. They can sustain fire not for hours, but for days. They can deliver not thousands, but hundreds of thousands of shells. Defense in depth, which depends on forward positions delaying enemy advance while reserves counterattack, fails when forward positions are annihilated before infantry even attacks. German army analysts examining Osterheld's report recognized the implications. If Americans could deliver such massive fire at will, then traditional German defensive doctrine was obsolete. No defensive position could withstand sustained fire at the intensity demonstrated on November 13th. No reserve units could counterattack if American artillery destroyed them during assembly or movement. The November 13th bombardment influenced German tactical thinking for the remainder of the war. Commanders were instructed to disperse defensive positions, avoiding concentration that would attract massive American fire. Units were ordered to maintain mobility, displacing frequently to avoid being targeted. Deep bunkers became essential, as only heavily fortified positions had any chance of surviving concentrated American artillery. But these adaptations could not overcome the fundamental disparity in firepower. Americans could fire massive concentrations whenever necessary. Germans could only endure and hope to survive. The industrial imbalance that allowed America to produce unlimited ammunition while Germany rationed every shell determined tactical outcomes, regardless of German skill or courage. The 4th Division's success using overwhelming artillery fire influenced American tactical doctrine for subsequent operations. Commanders recognized that when ammunition supply permitted, massive preparation fire could reduce casualties and speed advances. The bombardment became a template for later operations in the Ardennes, crossing the Rhine, and final advances into Germany. The 250,000 shells fired on November 13th represented just one day's expenditure by one division. Across all American forces in Europe, millions of shells were fired monthly. American industry produced artillery ammunition at rates that staggers imagination. In 1944 alone, American factories produced over 1.5 billion artillery shells of all calibers. This production was distributed across the army, with divisions receiving allocations based on tactical requirements. But even with this massive production, the 4th Division's expenditure was noteworthy. 250,000 shells in 24 hours was exceptional even by American standards. It demonstrated what American artillery could achieve when given unlimited ammunition and clear objectives. German soldiers captured after the November 13th bombardment provided American intelligence with detailed accounts of their experiences. These interrogation reports, preserved in National Archives files, reveal the psychological trauma inflicted by sustained artillery fire at unprecedented intensity. Gefreiter Otto Reinhardt, pulled from the collapsed bunker after 18 hours, required hospitalization for injuries sustained during the collapse and psychological trauma from the bombardment itself. His interrogation, conducted 3 days later when he had sufficiently recovered, provided American officers with insight into German perceptions. I have been a soldier for 4 years. I fought in Poland, France, and Russia. I survived Stalingrad until the final surrender. I believed I had experienced the worst combat could offer. The bombardment on November 13th was worse than anything at Stalingrad. The Russians would fire massive barrages before attacks, thousands of shells in 30 minutes to 1 hour. It was terrifying, but it ended. You knew you had to survive for a limited time, then the barrage would lift and you would fight the assault. On November 13th, there was no end. Hour after hour, the shells kept coming. After the first few hours, I stopped believing it would ever end. I thought the Americans would simply keep firing until everyone was dead. When our bunker finally collapsed, I felt relief. Either I would die quickly from the collapse, or I would be captured. Either was better than continuing to endure the bombardment. American interrogators noted that captured German soldiers consistently displayed symptoms of combat fatigue that psychiatrists would later recognize as post-traumatic stress. Men who had survived years of combat on multiple fronts showed signs of psychological breakdown after experiencing sustained American artillery fire. The comparison between American and Soviet artillery was inevitable. Germany had fought the Soviet Union for more than 3 years. By November 1944, German soldiers had extensive experience with Soviet artillery tactics and capabilities. Their assessments comparing American and Soviet artillery provided valuable intelligence on relative effectiveness. Hauptmann Friedrich Weber's diary, recovered from his body after the bombardment killed him, contained entries from earlier in 1944, comparing Eastern and Western Front artillery. Weber had commanded units on the Eastern Front before transferring west in summer 1944. Soviet artillery fires in massive concentrations before major offensives. The volume of fire is overwhelming, thousands of guns firing simultaneously, but Soviet fire control is crude. They saturate large areas rather than targeting specific positions. They fire for limited duration, perhaps 1 to 2 hours, then infantry attacks, while artillery shifts to deeper targets. If you survive the initial barrage in a deep position, you can emerge and fight the infantry assault. Soviet logistics cannot sustain prolonged intensive fire. After the initial barrage, subsequent fire support is limited. American artillery is completely different. The volume of fire is comparable to Soviet barrages during major offensives, but Americans sustain this volume for extended periods. Where Soviets fire intensively for 2 hours, Americans fire for 6, 12, or even 24 hours. American fire control is far superior. They target specific positions with precision. Forward observers adjust fire in real time, ensuring shells hit intended targets. American logistics seem unlimited. They never appear to run short of ammunition, regardless of how much they fire. Weber's analysis, written weeks before his death, proved prophetic. The bombardment that killed him demonstrated exactly the American capabilities he had described. Sustained fire, precision targeting, unlimited ammunition. These advantages combined to create artillery effectiveness that exceeded Soviet capabilities despite the Red Army's massive artillery forces. The Soviet Union fielded more artillery than any other nation during World War II. Soviet rifle divisions had substantial organic artillery, and separate artillery divisions provided additional fire support. During major offensives like Operation Bagration in summer 1944, Soviets concentrated thousands of guns on narrow frontages, achieving artillery densities that dwarfed German concentrations. But Soviet artillery suffered from limitations that reduced its effectiveness compared to American systems. Soviet fire control was less sophisticated, relying on massed fire to compensate for reduced accuracy. Soviet ammunition production, while massive, could not sustain intensive fire indefinitely. Soviet logistics struggled to deliver ammunition to forward units during rapid advances. American artillery combined Soviet-scale firepower with superior fire control, unlimited ammunition, and excellent logistics. This combination proved more effective than either German precision, with limited resources, or Soviet mass with crude control. The 4th Division's bombardment demonstrated all these advantages. Simultaneously, German military professionals analyzing their defeat after the war consistently identified American artillery as the most decisive conventional weapon employed against them in the West. Tanks and aircraft received more public attention, but artillery inflicted the majority of casualties and prevented effective German operations. General Franz Halder, former chief of the German General Staff, wrote in his post-war analysis titled German Strategy Against Russia, American artillery achieved dominance through systematic application of industrial methods to warfare. They produced ammunition in quantities that made conservation unnecessary. They developed fire control systems that allowed rapid, accurate fire from multiple batteries simultaneously. They trained personnel to operate as part of an integrated system rather than relying on individual skill. The result was artillery that could be employed flexibly, responsively, and devastatingly at any point commanders chose. German forces in the West operated under constant artillery threat. Any concentration of forces invited immediate, overwhelming fire. Any movement observed by forward observers resulted in accurate fire within minutes. This constant pressure prevented effective defensive operations and made offensive operations nearly impossible. The November 13th bombardment represented the extreme end of American artillery employment, but it exemplified capabilities that affected German operations throughout the campaign in northwest Europe. Germans learned that massing forces meant death from American artillery. Dispersing forces reduced artillery vulnerability, but also reduced combat effectiveness. This tactical dilemma had no solution within German capabilities. They could not match American firepower. They could not destroy American artillery through counter-battery fire, because American guns were more numerous, more mobile, and better supplied. They could not prevent American forward observers from detecting targets because American air superiority prevented interference with observation aircraft. German artillery officers, trained in a professional tradition emphasizing precise, economical fire, found themselves helpless against an enemy who could fire 10 shells for every one they fired. German battery commanders who had learned to calculate exact ammunition requirements for specific missions discovered those calculations were irrelevant when facing enemies who simply fired until targets ceased to exist. Lieutenant Hans Schäfer, the battery commander whose guns were destroyed in the opening minutes of November 13th, spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner of war camp in the United States. There, he observed American artillery training and discussed tactics with American officers who treated him with professional courtesy. In letters home written after the war, Schäfer reflected on what he had learned. American artillery officers are not necessarily more skilled than German officers in the technical aspects of gunnery. Their mathematical calculations are no more precise. Their understanding of ballistics is no deeper. What makes American artillery superior is the system within which they operate. They have tables pre-computed for every variable, eliminating field calculations. They have radios that allow instant communication between observers and guns. They have fire direction centers that coordinate multiple batteries as easily as we coordinated single guns. Most importantly, they have unlimited ammunition, which allows them to fire whenever necessary without concern for conservation. I watched American artillery crews train in the camp. They practiced rapid-fire drills, achieving rates of fire we considered possible only for brief periods. They sustained these rates for extended exercises because ammunition was unlimited. When I asked an American officer how long his battery could sustain maximum rate fire, he looked puzzled and said, "As long as ammunition trucks keep arriving." The concept of firing limitations due to ammunition shortage was foreign to him. This fundamental difference in mindset explains American artillery superiority more than any technical factor. The industrial capacity that produced unlimited ammunition also produced the guns, vehicles, and equipment that made American artillery so mobile and effective. Rock Island Arsenal and other facilities produced thousands of M2, A1 105mm howitzers, and M1 155mm howitzers during the war. These weapons, designed for reliability and ease of production, could be manufactured rapidly to precise tolerances. German artillery, often superior in design, could not be produced in equivalent numbers. German industry, disrupted by Allied bombing and hampered by inefficient resource allocation, produced guns at rates inadequate to replace losses. By late 1944, German artillery batteries often operated below authorized strength with worn guns that could not be replaced. The contrast in artillery ammunition production was even more stark. American factories produced shells using assembly line methods that emphasized quantity and consistency. Quality control ensured reliable fuses and consistent propellant charges. The result was ammunition that worked reliably and performed predictably. German ammunition production, hampered by labor shortages and resource constraints, suffered from inconsistent quality. Fuses failed at higher rates. Propellant charges varied, affecting accuracy. By 1944, some German shells were being produced using forced labor in substandard conditions, further reducing quality. These industrial differences translated directly into tactical effectiveness. American artillery fired reliable ammunition in unlimited quantities. German artillery fired less reliable ammunition in carefully rationed quantities. The cumulative effect over months of combat was decisive. The 4th Division's advance following the November 13th bombardment demonstrated how effective artillery preparation enabled successful infantry operations. The division captured objectives that had resisted multiple previous attacks, suffering relatively light casualties because German defensive capabilities had been destroyed by artillery. This pattern repeated throughout the final months of the war in Europe. American divisions preparing to attack would concentrate artillery, fire massive preparations, then advance against shattered German positions. German defenders, knowing what was coming, could do nothing to prevent it. They lacked the artillery to engage in counter-battery duels. They lacked the mobility to evade American fire. They could only endure and hope to survive. The psychological impact on German soldiers of this artillery superiority cannot be overstated. Men who entered the war confident in German military superiority ended war understanding that American industrial might had created capabilities Germany could never match. This realization, repeated across thousands of individual experiences, contributed to the collapse of German military effectiveness in the war's final months. By December 1944, German forces were preparing for their final major offensive in the West, the Ardennes offensive that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. German planning for this operation explicitly acknowledged American artillery superiority and designed tactics to minimize its impact. The offensive was scheduled to begin during winter weather that would prevent American air operations. Planners hoped this would reduce American observation capabilities and limit artillery effectiveness. The attack would emphasize speed, attempting to advance so rapidly that American artillery could not establish defensive fires. These measures proved inadequate. When the Ardennes offensive began on December 16, 1944, German forces achieved initial surprise and made significant penetrations. But American artillery, even without air observation, detected and engaged German units. Forward observers with surrounded American units called fire from Corps and Army artillery. German columns advancing through narrow roads found themselves under accurate fire that disrupted movement and inflicted heavy casualties. The Battle of Bastogne exemplified American artillery effectiveness during the Bulge. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded in the town, was supported by Corps artillery firing from outside the German encirclement. These guns, directed by forward observers with the airborne troops, broke up German attacks and prevented the town's capture. German forces, lacking equivalent artillery support and unable to engage American guns through counter-battery fire, could not overcome the surrounded garrison despite numerical superiority. When weather cleared after Christmas and American ammunition supply resumed following the initial disruption, American artillery fire intensified. The 4th Infantry Division, recovering from the Hürtgen Forest battles, participated in operations to reduce the Bulge. Their artillery, now experienced in delivering massive fire concentrations, helped break German offensive capability. During the entire Bulge campaign, American artillery fired over 1.2 million shells. German artillery, hampered by fuel shortages that prevented displacement and ammunition shortages that limited fire, could not respond effectively. The disparity in fire support was among the decisive factors leading to German defeat in the Ardennes. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, the veteran NCO who had compared American and Soviet artillery after being wounded in the Hürtgen, was captured during the Bulge. His interrogation report contained observations about the evolution of American artillery tactics from November through January. In the Hürtgen, American artillery was already superior to anything we could employ. During the Ardennes offensive, their artillery became even more effective. Despite our achieving tactical surprise, despite weather that prevented their air operations, their artillery found us and engaged us wherever we moved. We captured American positions and found their forward observers had called artillery fire on their own locations rather than surrender them to us. This meant we were engaged by artillery even when we overran American units. The psychological effect was devastating. We could not escape American fire even when we advanced. Eventually, our offensive stalled not primarily due to American counterattacks, but because we could not move under their artillery fire. The final months of the war saw continued American artillery dominance. As German ammunition production collapsed and fuel shortages immobilized artillery, American fire support remained constant. German defenders facing American attacks knew they would endure hours of preparatory bombardment before infantry attacked. This knowledge destroyed morale and will to resist. German prisoners in the war's final weeks consistently displayed symptoms of artillery-induced trauma. Medical officers examining prisoners noted high rates of hearing damage, tremors, and psychological distress related to artillery exposure. Some prisoners, upon learning they would be interrogated, begged not to be sent back to combat, stating they could not endure more artillery fire. The Hürtgen Forest campaign, where the 4th Division's November 13th bombardment occurred, continued through December 1944. American casualties in the Hürtgen totaled approximately 33,000, making it one of the costliest battles fought by the US Army in Europe. German casualties were comparable, with additional thousands captured. The forest itself was devastated. Post-war photographs show a landscape stripped bare by artillery fire. Trees were reduced to splintered stumps. The earth was cratered every few meters. Villages within the forest were completely destroyed, requiring rebuilding from foundations. Unexploded ordnance remained a hazard for decades after the war, occasionally killing or injuring civilians and limiting forest use. The November 13th bombardment, while exceptional in its intensity, was just one day among many when American artillery pounded German positions in the Hürtgen. The cumulative effect of weeks of artillery fire broke German defensive capabilities and enabled eventual American victory, though at terrible cost to both sides. Historical analysis of the Hürtgen Forest campaign remains contentious. Some historians argue the campaign was unnecessary, that American forces should have bypassed the forest and allowed it to be taken later. Others defend the campaign as necessary to protect the southern flank of advancing Allied armies and to secure the Ruhr River dams. What is not contentious is the effectiveness of American artillery in eventually reducing German positions. When American commanders committed sufficient artillery resources and ammunition, as on November 13th, German defences collapsed. The lesson was clear. American industrial capacity, properly applied through artillery fire, could overcome even the most determined German resistance. The 4th Infantry Division's experience in the Hürtgen influenced post-war American artillery doctrine. The effectiveness of massed fires in destroying prepared defences validated investments in artillery and ammunition production. The coordination between forward observers and fire direction centres became the model for subsequent artillery organisation. Lieutenant Colonel William Westmoreland, who planned the November 13th bombardment, rose through the ranks to become General Westmoreland, Commander of U.S. Military Assistance Command Vietnam, from 1964 to 1968. His experience with artillery in World War II influenced his approach to the Vietnam War, where he emphasized firepower and attrition. The effectiveness of massive fire support in World War II created expectations that proved difficult to meet in the different circumstances of counterinsurgency warfare. The 250,000 shells fired by the 4th Division on November 13th represented the apex of American artillery employment in World War II. Never before had a single division fired so many shells in 24 hours. The record stands today, more than 80 years later, as testament to the industrial capacity America mobilized for World War II. This single day's bombardment consumed ammunition equivalent to entire months of production for some nations. The shells fired weighed thousands of tons. The high explosive delivered was equivalent to small nuclear weapons in destructive force, though dispersed across a wider area and longer time period. The logistics of delivering this ammunition to guns, the coordination of fire control, and the sustained firing by gun crews all represented extraordinary achievements. German survivors of the bombardment carried memories of that day for the remainder of their lives. Post-war interviews conducted decades later showed that veterans could still recall the sound, the concussion, the helplessness of being unable to do anything except endure. Many veterans described November 13th, 1944, as the worst day of their war. Gefreiter Otto Reinhardt, who survived the bunker collapse, immigrated to Canada after the war. In a 1985 interview conducted for a documentary on the Hürtgen Forest campaign, Reinhardt reflected on his experience. "I have been asked many times what was the most frightening moment of my time as a soldier. People expect me to describe close combat, or being wounded, or facing enemy tanks. The most frightening experience was being helpless in that bunker while the world above was destroyed. We could do nothing. We could not fight back. We could not escape. We could only wait and hope the bunker would hold and that we would survive. When the ceiling finally collapsed, part of me was relieved. At least the waiting was over. At least I would either die quickly or be captured. Either was better than continuing to endure hour after hour of bombardment with no end in sight." The story of the 4th Infantry Division's bombardment on November 13th, 1944 is ultimately a story about the transformation of warfare through industrial capacity. Artillery had been a decisive weapon since the invention of gunpowder, but World War II saw artillery reach new levels of effectiveness through the combination of improved technology, better coordination, and most importantly, unlimited ammunition supply. The Germans entered World War II with excellent artillery and well-trained crews. They developed sophisticated doctrine, emphasizing precision and economy of force, but they fought with limited resources, carefully rationing ammunition and conserving supplies. This approach, necessary given Germany's industrial limitations, proved inadequate against an enemy who could fire without restraint. The Americans entered World War II with artillery that was adequate, but not exceptional. Their early doctrine emphasized traditional methods, but they possessed industrial capacity that allowed them to produce ammunition in quantities that made conservation irrelevant. They developed coordination systems that allowed responsive, accurate fire. They trained personnel to operate within these systems effectively. The combination created artillery superiority that proved decisive. The 250,000 shells fired on November 13th represented not just explosive force, but American industrial might. Each shell had been produced in a factory, transported across the Atlantic, moved through supply chains to artillery batteries, and fired by trained crews. The logistics and coordination required to deliver this level of fire demonstrated organizational capabilities that Germany could not match. For German soldiers facing this fire, the experience was transformative. They entered the war believing in German military superiority. They ended the war understanding that industrial capacity, not tactical skill, ultimately determined outcomes in modern warfare. No amount of courage or tactical brilliance could overcome the material disparity between German and American capabilities. The bombardment broke German defences in the Hürtgen Forest. It enabled American advances that would have cost far more casualties without artillery preparation. It demonstrated that when American commanders committed sufficient resources, German positions could be destroyed regardless of fortification strength or defender determination. Most significantly, the bombardment demonstrated the future of warfare. Industrial capacity to produce unlimited ammunition, coordination systems to employ it effectively, and willingness to expend resources at rates previously considered wasteful would characterize American military doctrine for decades to come. The lessons learned on November 13, 1944, would influence American artillery employment in Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent conflicts. The German soldiers who survived would never forget the day when one American division fired 250,000 shells. For them, it represented the moment when they understood, with absolute certainty, that Germany had lost the war, not through defeat in a single battle, but through the crushing realization that American industrial might could deliver firepower at scales Germany could never match or counter. The mathematics were inescapable. 250,000 shells in 24 hours, 10,000 shells per hour, 173 shells per minute, nearly 3 shells every second for an entire day. These numbers told a story of industrial supremacy that no tactical skill could overcome. They represented the transformation of warfare from a contest of military skill to a contest of industrial capacity, and in that contest, America's ability to produce, deliver, and fire unlimited ammunition proved decisive. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.